The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as Marcus Thompson stepped off the tour bus with his college friends. At 22 years old, Marcus considered himself tough, street-smart, and unimpressed by what he called military theater. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood where respect was earned through intimidation, and he carried that attitude wherever he went. His girlfriend Sarah walked beside him, already feeling uncomfortable about the way Marcus was talking. "This is supposed to be sacred ground, Marcus," she whispered as they approached the white marble steps leading to the tomb of the unknown soldier. "Maybe just try to be respectful." Marcus laughed loudly, causing several other visitors to turn and look. "Respectful of what? Some guys playing dress-up and marching around in circles, please. I've seen tougher security guards at the mall." His voice carried further than it should have in the solemn atmosphere of the cemetery. The group of tourists began to gather around the tomb, a simple white marble structure that stood as a monument to unidentified American soldiers who had died in various wars. Most visitors spoke in hushed tones, understanding the weight of what the tomb represented. Children held their parents' hands tighter, sensing the serious mood that surrounded them. But Marcus seemed determined to prove a point that nobody had asked him to make. He pulled out his phone and started taking selfies, making exaggerated tough guy faces and flexing his muscles in front of the monument. "Check this out," he said to his friends. "I'm gonna get a video of me messing with one of these toy soldiers." Sarah tugged at his arm. "Marcus, stop. This isn't the place for this kind of behavior. These guards are honoring fallen soldiers who died for our country." Her voice was becoming more urgent, but Marcus brushed off her concerns. "Died for our country?" Marcus scoffed. "They died because they were dumb enough to sign up for someone else's war. And these guards? They're just putting on a show for tourists like us. Watch me prove it." An older veteran standing nearby overheard Marcus and shook his head in disgust. The man wore a Vietnam War veteran cap and had tears in his eyes as he looked at the tomb. He approached Marcus with measured steps.
"Son, you might want to reconsider your attitude.
This place represents something bigger than whatever point you think you're trying to make." Marcus turned to face the older man, his chest puffed out in a display of false bravado. "And what's that supposed to mean, old man? You think I should be scared of some guy in a costume walking back and forth? I've dealt with real threats on real streets. This is just pageantry." The veteran's weathered face showed a mixture of sadness and anger. "Those aren't costumes, son. Those are uniforms worn by some of the most dedicated and disciplined soldiers in our military. The tomb guards of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, known as the Old Guard, maintain a vigil here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of weather conditions. They've been doing this since 1937, so what?" Marcus replied, his voice getting louder. "That just makes them even more ridiculous. Standing around in the rain and snow for dead people who can't even appreciate it. At least rent-a-cops get to sit down sometimes." Sarah was now visibly embarrassed and angry. "Marcus, please stop. You're making a scene and you're being incredibly disrespectful. These people died serving our country and the guards are honoring their sacrifice." But Marcus was too caught up in his own performance to listen to reason. He had attracted a small crowd of disapproving onlookers, and rather than backing down, he seemed energized by the attention. "You know what? I bet I could make one of these guards break character. They're probably just college kids like us playing soldier for the summer." The veteran stepped closer, his voice firm but controlled. "Son, I strongly advise you to stop this behavior immediately. You're not just disrespecting the guards. You're disrespecting every service member who has ever worn the uniform, including those who never made it home." Marcus laughed and turned back toward the tomb, where a sentinel was beginning his measured walk across the plaza. The guard moved with perfect precision, each step exactly 21 paces, his rifle held with practiced ease. His uniform was immaculate, every brass button polished to a mirror shine, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. "Watch this," Marcus announced to anyone who would listen. "I'm going to show you how easy it is to rattle these guys." He began walking toward the guard, his phone held up to record what he clearly thought would be a humorous video to share with his friends later. The other tourists began to step back, sensing that something inappropriate was about to happen. Some pulled out their own phones, not to support Marcus, but to document what they suspected would be his comeuppance. Sarah made one last attempt to grab his arm, but Marcus shrugged her off. "Marcus, don't do this," she pleaded. "You're going to get in serious trouble, and you're embarrassing yourself and everyone who came with you." But Marcus was beyond listening to reason. He approached the rope barrier that separated tourists from the guard's walking area, his swagger becoming more pronounced with each step. The morning sun seemed to grow hotter, and the air around the tomb felt charged with tension. The sentinel continued his methodical pace, seemingly unaware of Marcus's approach, though several experienced visitors noticed the slight tensing of the guard's shoulders. The tomb guard had undoubtedly dealt with disrespectful visitors before, but Marcus seemed determined to push boundaries that others had learned to respect. As Marcus reached the rope barrier, he called out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hey, soldier boy. Yeah, you in the fancy outfit. How about you stop playing parade and have a real conversation with someone who actually lives in the real world?" The other tourists gasped at his audacity, and Sarah covered her face with her hands in horror. The veteran who had tried to warn Marcus shook his head and muttered a prayer under his breath. Everyone present seemed to understand that Marcus had just crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and that the consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways he had never imagined. The moment Marcus's words echoed across the sacred plaza, something shifted in the atmosphere around the tomb of the unknown soldier. The sentinel, who had been maintaining his precise 21-step pattern for the past hour, suddenly stopped mid-stride. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the city beyond the cemetery gates. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez had been guarding the tomb for 3 years, and in that time, he had encountered every type of disrespectful behavior imaginable. Drunk tourists, giggling teenagers, and even a few protesters had all tested his resolve. But something about Marcus's tone and attitude triggered a response that went beyond his usual professional detachment. Without turning his head, Rodriguez executed a perfect about-face maneuver, his polished black shoes clicking against the marble with military precision, his eyes sharp as steel and trained through countless hours of discipline, locked onto Marcus with an intensity that seemed to penetrate straight through to his soul. Marcus felt the first flicker of unease as the guard's gaze met his own, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Too many people were watching, and his reputation as someone who didn't back down from anyone was on the line. He took another step closer to the rope barrier, his phone still recording. "That's right, look at me," Marcus continued, his voice slightly less confident than before but still loud enough to disturb the sacred quiet. "I bet you've never been in a real fight, have you? Just practiced your little dance moves and learned how to stand still like a statue." The veteran who had tried to warn Marcus earlier moved closer to Sarah, his face grave with concern. "Miss, you need to get your friend away from there immediately," he whispered urgently. "He has no idea what he's dealing with." Sarah was already in tears, mortified by Marcus's behavior and terrified of what might happen next. "He won't listen to me," she said through sobs. "He thinks he's proving something, but he's just making everything worse." Rodriguez began walking toward Marcus with the same measured pace he used during his guard duty. But there was something different about his movement now. Each step seemed to carry the weight of not just his own training and dedication, but the honor of every unknown soldier lying beneath the tomb he was sworn to protect. As the guard approached, Marcus could see details that hadn't been visible from a distance. Rodriguez's uniform wasn't just clean. It was perfect in a way that spoke of hours of meticulous preparation. Every brass button gleamed like a mirror, every crease was sharp enough to draw blood, and every piece of equipment was positioned with mathematical precision. But it was Rodriguez's eyes that began to unnerve Marcus the most. They held a depth of purpose and conviction that Marcus had never encountered before. These weren't the eyes of someone playing dress-up or going through the motions of a job. These were the eyes of a man who had dedicated his life to something far greater than himself. "You are in a restricted area," Rodriguez announced, his voice cutting through the morning air with the authority of absolute conviction. "I am directing you to step back and maintain appropriate conduct in this sacred place." Marcus laughed, but the sound came out hollow and forced. "Sacred place? It's a chunk of marble with some dead guys underneath it. And who are you to tell me what to do? You work for me, soldier boy. My tax dollars pay your salary." The crowd of tourists had grown larger, drawn by the commotion but maintaining a respectful distance. Many of them began pulling out their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. An elderly woman wearing a Gold Star mother pin shook her head in disgust and whispered a prayer for the unknown soldiers whose rest was being disturbed. Rodriguez took another step forward. and Marcus noticed for the first time the ceremonial rifle the guard carried. It wasn't just a prop or a symbol. It was a genuine military weapon, maintained in perfect condition and handled with the expertise of someone who knew exactly how to use it. The bayonet attached to its end caught the morning sunlight and gleamed with deadly sharpness. "This is your final warning," Rodriguez said, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, but somehow carrying more authority than any screaming drill sergeant Marcus had ever seen in movies. "You will step away from the tomb, maintain respectful behavior, or you will be removed from these grounds." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but his pride and his audience prevented him from backing down. "Oh yeah, you and what army? You're just one guy with a fancy hat and a museum piece rifle. I've dealt with real tough guys in real situations. You're nothing but a toy soldier playing pretend." What Marcus didn't understand was that Rodriguez wasn't just one guard. He was part of an elite unit known as the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, and every member of that unit considered the tomb their most sacred responsibility. Behind the scenes, other guards were already being alerted to the situation through discreet communication systems. Rodriguez had also endured training that went far beyond what Marcus could imagine. The selection process for tomb guards was rigorous, requiring not just physical excellence but mental fortitude, emotional stability, and an unwavering commitment to honor. Guards had to memorize detailed information about Arlington National Cemetery and the tomb, pass stringent physical fitness tests, and undergo months of specialized training. "You clearly don't understand where you are or what this place represents," Rodriguez continued, his composure remaining perfect despite Marcus's escalating aggression. "These grounds are the final resting place of hundreds of thousands of American service members, including the unknown soldiers whose sacrifice you are dishonoring with your behavior." Marcus waved his hand dismissively, but several people in the crowd noticed that his hand was beginning to shake slightly. "Spare me the history lesson, G.I. Joe. I didn't come here for a lecture about dead soldiers. I came here to show my friends that all this military stuff is just an act, and you're proving my point by giving speeches instead of actually doing anything about it." Sarah approached the rope barrier herself, tears streaming down her face. "Marcus, please stop this. You're humiliating yourself and disrespecting people who died serving our country. This isn't who you really are. Please just walk away." But Marcus was too deep into his performance to stop now. The combination of adrenaline, pride, and the attention he was receiving had pushed him past the point of rational thinking. He began to step over the rope barrier that separated tourists from the tomb area, crossing into space that had been sacred and protected for decades. "Let's see what happens when someone doesn't follow your little rules," Marcus announced as his foot touched the marble plaza, where only authorized personnel were allowed to walk. The moment Marcus's shoe made contact with the sacred ground, Rodriguez's entire demeanor shifted. The professional restraint that had characterized his previous warnings disappeared, replaced by something far more serious and commanding. This was no longer a matter of crowd control or tourist management. Marcus had just violated one of the most sacred spaces in American military tradition, and the consequences of that action were about to unfold with swift and decisive precision. The instant Marcus's foot touched the marble plaza, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez moved with a speed and precision that caught everyone by surprise. In one fluid motion, he executed a perfect about-face and began marching directly toward Marcus with the measured steps of military precision, but there was an urgency in his movement that hadn't been there during his ceremonial patrol. "It is requested that everyone maintain a level of respect and decorum befitting these hallowed grounds." Rodriguez's voice boomed across the plaza with such authority that even tourists 50 yards away immediately stopped talking and stood straighter. The transformation from his previous conversational tone to this commanding presence was so dramatic that Marcus actually stumbled backward a step. But Marcus was already inside the sacred perimeter, and Rodriguez continued his advance. "The tomb of the unknown soldier is a sacred shrine and will be treated as such. All visitors will maintain appropriate conduct." Marcus tried to laugh off his growing nervousness, but his voice cracked slightly as he responded. "Wow, you can yell. Congratulations, but you still can't actually do anything to me. What are you going to do, arrest me for walking on your precious marble? This is America, buddy. I have rights." What Marcus didn't know was that he had just triggered a carefully choreographed response system that had been perfected over decades of dealing with disrespectful visitors. Rodriguez wasn't just shouting random commands. He was following specific protocols designed to de-escalate situations while maintaining the dignity of the site. Behind the scenes, other members of the old guard were already responding to discreet signals. Military police stationed throughout the cemetery had been alerted, and additional tomb guards were positioning themselves at strategic locations around the plaza. Marcus thought he was dealing with one isolated guard, but he had actually poked a highly trained and coordinated military unit. Rodriguez stopped directly in front of Marcus, close enough that the young man could see every detail of the guard's immaculate uniform and feel the intensity of his unwavering stare. "Sir, you are in violation of federal regulations governing conduct at Arlington National Cemetery. You will remove yourself from this restricted area immediately, or you will be physically removed and charged accordingly." The crowd of tourists had grown substantially, and their mood was becoming increasingly hostile toward Marcus. What had started as curiosity about a minor disturbance was turning into genuine anger as people realized the extent of his disrespect. Several veterans in the crowd were openly expressing their disgust, and more than one person was calling for security. Sarah pushed through the crowd and reached the rope barrier, her face red with embarrassment and fear. "Marcus, please!" "You've made your point. Just come back over here and let's leave. You're scaring me and you're making everyone here angry." Marcus glanced around and noticed for the first time that he had become the center of hostile attention from dozens of people. But instead of backing down, his defensive instincts kicked in, and he doubled down on his aggressive behavior. "I'm not scared of some guy in a costume. And I'm not scared of a bunch of tourist sheep who think they need to worship dead soldiers." An older man wearing a Purple Heart pin stepped forward from the crowd. "Son, those dead soldiers you're talking about died so you could have the freedom to act like an idiot. But freedom doesn't mean you can disrespect sacred ground. You need to step away from that guard before you get yourself in serious trouble." Rodriguez remained motionless, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. The guard's discipline was absolute. Despite Marcus's continued provocations, he showed no sign of anger or frustration. His training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but it had also taught him when and how to escalate force if necessary. "This is your final opportunity to comply voluntarily," Rodriguez stated, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Federal law enforcement is en route, and your continued presence in this restricted area constitutes a federal offense punishable by significant fines and imprisonment." Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine at the mention of federal charges, but his pride wouldn't let him show weakness in front of so many people. "Federal offense? For walking on some marble? You've got to be kidding me. This whole thing is ridiculous." It's just a tourist attraction with delusions of grandeur. What Marcus didn't understand was that Arlington National Cemetery operated under special federal jurisdiction, and the tomb of the unknown soldier was protected by laws that carried serious penalties. Interfering with military ceremonies, disrespecting military monuments, and entering restricted areas were all federal crimes that could result in substantial fines and jail time. Rodriguez raised his ceremonial rifle slightly, not in a threatening manner, but in a way that demonstrated his absolute readiness to defend the sacred space he was sworn to protect. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and everyone in the crowd recognized it as a sign that the situation was about to escalate significantly. "You are ordered to step back beyond the rope barrier immediately," Rodriguez commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been disobeyed when giving such a direct order. "Any further resistance will be met with appropriate force." Marcus looked around desperately, suddenly realizing that his situation had deteriorated far beyond what he had anticipated. The hostile crowd, the mention of federal charges, and the absolute determination in the guard's eyes were beginning to penetrate his bravado. But with so many people watching and recording, he felt trapped by his own pride. "Appropriate force?" Marcus tried to laugh, but the sound came out strained and nervous. "What are you going to do, attack a civilian with your parade rifle? I'd like to see you try. There are witnesses everywhere, and I'm recording everything on my phone." Rodriguez noticed that Marcus's hand holding the phone was shaking visibly now, and beads of sweat were forming on the young man's forehead despite the cool morning air. The guard's training had taught him to read body language and recognize when someone was beginning to realize they were in over their head. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard, and several people in the crowd pointed toward the road leading to the tomb. Military police vehicles were making their way through the cemetery, Their occupants alerted to the situation and prepared to provide backup if necessary. Sarah was now crying openly, both from embarrassment and fear for what might happen to Marcus. "Please, Marcus," she called out desperately. "Just step back and apologize. Say you're sorry and let's leave before this gets any worse. You don't want to get arrested, especially not here." But Marcus had backed himself into a corner through his own arrogance, and he couldn't see a way out that would allow him to save face. The approaching sirens, the hostile crowd, and the unwavering determination of the tomb guard were all closing in around him, but his pride demanded that he continue his foolish stand. "I'm not apologizing to anyone," Marcus declared, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "I haven't done anything wrong except expose this whole military worship charade for what it really is." Rodriguez remained perfectly still, but those who knew how to read military bearing could see that he was prepared to take whatever action might be necessary. The tomb guard's oath wasn't just ceremonial. It was a binding commitment to protect and defend the sacred ground he stood upon, and that commitment extended to removing any threat to its dignity, regardless of the personal cost. The military police vehicles came to a stop at the edge of the plaza with practiced precision, their occupants emerging with the calm efficiency of professionals who had dealt with similar situations before. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, the lead military police officer, assessed the scene immediately. One civilian inside the restricted perimeter, a crowd of agitated tourists, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez maintaining his position with textbook military bearing. Marcus watched the officers approach and felt his stomach drop. These weren't mall security guards or local police who might be willing to overlook his behavior with a warning. These were federal law enforcement officers with the authority to arrest him on serious charges, and their expressions made it clear that they took their responsibilities very seriously. "Sir, I am Sergeant First Class Santos with the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment Military Police," the lead officer announced as she approached the rope barrier. "You are currently in violation of federal law by entering a restricted area of Arlington National Cemetery. You need to exit the perimeter immediately and comply with our instructions." Marcus looked around desperately, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of his situation. The crowd had grown to nearly 100 people, many of them veterans who were visibly angry about his behavior. Several people were holding up phones, recording every moment of his humiliation for posterity. His girlfriend Sarah was sobbing openly, and even his college friends had distanced themselves from him both physically and emotionally. "This is insane," Marcus said, his voice now clearly showing signs of panic. "I'm just a tourist who stepped over a rope. You're acting like I committed some major crime. Don't you people have real criminals to worry about?" Sergeant Santos maintained her professional demeanor, but her voice carried unmistakable authority. "Sir, interfering with military ceremonies and entering restricted federal property are serious offenses. Under federal law, specifically Title 36 of the United States Code, violations can result in fines up to $5,000 and imprisonment for up to 6 months. You will step out of the restricted area now." The mention of specific laws and potential jail time hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had expected maybe a scolding or at worst a small fine, but 6 months in federal prison was a reality he had never considered. His bravado began crumbling as the true consequences of his actions became clear. Rodriguez continued to stand at perfect attention, his rifle held with unwavering precision. Despite Marcus's continued presence in the restricted area, the tomb guard's discipline remained absolute. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, and he would maintain his post regardless of how long it took to resolve the disturbance. "Look, maybe we can work something out," Marcus said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that contradicted his earlier aggressive stance. "I didn't know about any federal laws. Nobody told me I couldn't step over the rope." "Can't you just give me a warning this time?" Sergeant Santos shook her head firmly. "Sir, ignorance of the law is not a defense, and there are multiple signs posted throughout the cemetery explaining appropriate conduct. You were also given several warnings by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez before you entered the restricted area. Your continued presence here is making your situation worse with each passing moment." An older veteran in the crowd called out, "Son, just do what they're telling you. You've already embarrassed yourself enough. Don't make it worse by resisting arrest." The man's voice carried the weight of experience and genuine concern, but Marcus was too panicked to appreciate the advice. Sarah pushed through to the front of the crowd, her face streaked with tears. "Marcus, please. Just step back and do whatever they say. This isn't worth going to jail over. Think about your future, your scholarship, everything you'll lose if you get a federal conviction. The mention of his scholarship hit Marcus harder than any of the legal threats had. He was a senior in college on a partial academic scholarship, and a federal conviction could destroy his chances of graduating or finding employment after college. The reality of how completely he had sabotaged his own future was beginning to sink in. "I want to step back," Marcus said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "But there are so many people watching and they're all recording me. This is going to be all over the internet by tonight. My life is already ruined." Rodriguez spoke for the first time since the military police had arrived, his voice carrying a tone of unexpected compassion despite his unwavering discipline. "Sir, your life is not ruined unless you choose to make it so. Step back, show respect for this sacred ground, and accept the consequences of your actions with dignity. That is the beginning of redemption, not the end of your future." The crowd murmured in approval of the guard's words, and several people nodded in agreement. Even in the midst of his righteous duty to protect the tomb, Rodriguez was showing the character and wisdom that had made him worthy of his sacred assignment. But Marcus was paralyzed by fear and embarrassment. He stood frozen in the middle of the marble plaza, surrounded by military personnel and hostile tourists, knowing that any movement he made would be captured on dozens of cameras and shared across social media platforms within hours. Sergeant Santos took a step closer to the rope barrier, her hand moving to the handcuffs on her belt. "Sir, you have 30 seconds to voluntarily step out of the restricted area. After that time, we will enter the perimeter and physically remove you, which will result in additional charges for resisting arrest and interfering with military operations." The crowd fell silent as everyone waited to see what Marcus would do. Some people looked angry, others appeared sympathetic, but all of them understood that they were witnessing a moment that would define Marcus's character and possibly his entire future. The weight of that realization seemed to press down on him like a physical force. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to face the consequences of his actions. When he opened them again, he saw Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looking at him with an expression that held no hatred or mockery, only the steady gaze of a professional soldier who understood duty, honor, and the importance of doing the right thing even when it was difficult. "I don't know how to fix this," Marcus admitted, his voice breaking with emotion. "I came here thinking I was going to prove something, and instead I've proven that I'm an idiot who doesn't understand anything important. How do I make this right?" Rodriguez nodded slightly, recognizing that Marcus was finally beginning to understand the gravity of his situation. "You begin by showing respect for the fallen soldiers this tomb represents, and by accepting responsibility for your actions without making excuses. Honor is not about never making mistakes. It is about how you respond when you realize you have made them." The words hit Marcus with unexpected force, and for the first time since arriving at the cemetery, he truly looked at the simple marble tomb behind him. It wasn't just a tourist attraction or a symbol of military pageantry. It was a memorial to real people who had died in service to their country, people whose identities were unknown, but whose sacrifice was honored by guards like Rodriguez, who dedicated their lives to maintaining a sacred vigil. Sergeant Santos raised her hand, preparing to signal her officers to enter the restricted area and arrest Marcus by force. The 30 seconds she had given him were nearly over, and his continued hesitation was only making his legal situation worse. The moment of decision had arrived, and everyone present knew that Marcus's next action would determine whether he left Arlington Cemetery as someone who had learned from his mistakes or as someone who would face the full consequences of his disrespectful behavior. With only seconds left before Sergeant Santos would order his arrest, Marcus finally took a shaky step backward toward the rope barrier. His movement was hesitant and clumsy, a stark contrast to the precise military bearing of the guards surrounding him. As his foot crossed back over the boundary into the tourist area, he could hear a collective exhale from the crowd, as if everyone had been holding their breath. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, though his voice was so quiet that only those closest to him could hear the words. "I'm really sorry." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez executed a perfect about-face and returned to his position at the tomb, resuming his ceremonial vigil as if the entire confrontation had never happened. His discipline and professionalism were so complete that within moments, He appeared to be nothing more than a silent sentinel honoring the unknown dead, though everyone present knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Sergeant Santos nodded to her officers, who lowered their hands from their equipment but remained alert and ready. "Sir, you are still subject to citation for your violations of federal regulations," she informed Marcus as she approached him. "Please provide your identification and remain here while we complete our investigation." Marcus fumbled for his wallet with trembling hands, dropping it twice before managing to extract his driver's license. The document that had always seemed like a symbol of his adult independence now felt like evidence that would be used against him in federal court. He handed it to Sergeant Santos, unable to meet her eyes. As the military police officer examined his identification and began filling out paperwork, Marcus became aware of the dozens of camera phones still pointed in his direction. His moment of public humiliation was being preserved in high-definition video that would likely be shared thousands of times across social media platforms before the day was over. Sarah approached him cautiously, her face still wet with tears. "Marcus, are you okay? What were you thinking? This isn't like you at all." Her voice carried a mixture of relief that he hadn't been arrested and confusion about what had driven him to such extreme behavior. "I don't know what I was thinking," Marcus replied honestly, his voice hollow with shock and regret. "I thought I was being tough and showing off, but I was just being stupid and disrespectful. I've never felt so ashamed in my entire life." The veteran who had tried to warn Marcus earlier walked over to where he stood, his expression serious but not unkind. "Son, you made a serious mistake today, but the fact that you finally stepped back and apologized shows that you might still learn from this experience. Those guards aren't just playing soldier. They're honoring men who died for something bigger than themselves." Marcus nodded numbly, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what the tomb represented. "I never really thought about it that way," he admitted. "I always saw military stuff as just, I don't know, people following orders and marching around. I never considered that it was about honoring people who gave their lives for others." Sergeant Santos returned with his license and a citation that would require him to appear in federal court. "Mr. Thompson, you are being cited for violation of federal regulations governing conduct at Arlington National Cemetery. You will need to appear in court at the date and time specified on this citation. Failure to appear will result in additional charges and a warrant for your arrest." Marcus stared at the official document in his hands, seeing his name printed next to words like federal violation and court appearance. The reality of facing a federal judge and potentially paying thousands of dollars in fines was overwhelming, especially for a college student already struggling with the costs of education. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "Will this affect my scholarship? My graduation? My ability to get a job after college?" Sergeant Santos's expression softened slightly, recognizing genuine remorse when she saw it. "Mr. Thompson, that will depend on several factors, including how you handle yourself in court and whether you demonstrate that you've learned from this experience. Federal convictions can have serious consequences, but judges sometimes show leniency for first-time offenders who show genuine remorse and understanding." As word of the incident spread beyond the immediate crowd, more people began arriving at the tomb to see what had happened. The story was already being shared on social media, with videos of Marcus's confrontation with the tomb guard garnering thousands of views and comments, most of them harshly critical of his behavior. Marcus's college friends, who had maintained their distance during the confrontation, finally approached him with expressions of shock and disappointment. "Dude, what were you thinking?" one of them asked. "This is going to be everywhere online by tonight. Everyone at school is going to see this." The realization that his humiliation would follow him back to campus and potentially affect his relationships with classmates and professors hit Marcus like another physical blow. He had not only disrespected fallen soldiers and embarrassed himself in front of strangers, but he had also created a permanent record of his poor judgment that would be accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Sarah took his arm gently, trying to provide some comfort despite her own shock and embarrassment. "Marcus, we need to get you out of here before this gets any worse. Let's go back to the hotel and figure out what we need to do next." But even as they prepared to leave, Marcus found himself looking back at Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who continued his solemn vigil at the tomb with the same dedication and precision he had shown before the confrontation began. The guard's commitment to his duty, even after being disrespected and threatened, was a lesson in character that Marcus was only beginning to appreciate. "Wait," Marcus said, stopping Sarah as she tried to lead him away. "I need to do something first." He walked back toward the rope barrier, though he was careful to remain well within the tourist area this time. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was in the middle of his 21-step patrol when Marcus called out, his voice respectful and subdued. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Marcus said, his words carrying across the plaza. "I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. I'm sorry for disrespecting you, the tomb, and the soldiers you're honoring. You showed more character and professionalism today than I've shown in my entire life." Rodriguez completed his measured steps to the end of his patrol route before executing his about-face. For just a moment his eyes met Marcus's across the plaza, and the young man saw a slight nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was recognition that Marcus was beginning to understand the importance of what he had witnessed. As Marcus and his group finally left the tomb of the unknown soldier, he carried with him not just a federal citation and the humiliation of his public mistake, but also a new understanding of honor, duty, and the price that others had paid for the freedoms he had taken for granted. The real consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. But for the first time since arriving at Arlington Cemetery, he was facing them with something approaching the dignity that the sacred ground demanded. The videos of his confrontation with the tomb guard were already going viral online, ensuring that his moment of poor judgment would be preserved and shared far beyond the confines of the cemetery. Marcus Thompson had wanted to prove something to his friends and strangers alike, and he had succeeded, though not in the way he had intended. By the time Marcus and his group reached their hotel room, the videos of his confrontation with the tomb guard had already been viewed over 50,000 times across various social media platforms. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications from friends, classmates, and even complete strangers who had seen the footage and wanted to share their opinions about his behavior. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through the comments on one of the viral videos with a look of horror on her face. "Marcus, you need to see this," she said quietly. "It's really bad. People are calling for you to be expelled from college, and someone already figured out your name and posted your social media profiles." Marcus felt sick to his stomach as he read through the hundreds of comments, most of them expressing outrage and disgust at his behavior. Words like disrespectful, entitled, coward, and much worse filled the screen, accompanied by angry emojis and calls for serious legal punishment. Several people had already shared the video to military support groups, veterans organizations, and college forums. "This is insane," Marcus said, his voice shaking as he continued reading. "People are sharing my personal information, my girlfriend's name, even details about my scholarship. Someone posted my dorm room number and my class schedule. How is this legal?" One of his college friends, Jake, was sitting in the corner of the room looking at his own phone with a grim expression. "Dude, it's not just random people online anymore." The story got picked up by a military news website, and they're calling it, "College Student Disrespects Fallen Heroes at Arlington Cemetery." This is becoming national news. The weight of that realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. What had started as a moment of poor judgment to impress his friends had escalated into a national story about disrespect for military service and fallen soldiers. His name and face were now associated with one of the most shameful displays of civilian disrespect at one of America's most sacred military sites. Sarah's phone rang, and she looked at the caller ID with confusion. "It's my mom," she said. How could she already know about this? She answered the call, and Marcus could hear her mother's voice through the speaker, clearly upset and demanding to know what had happened. After Sarah finished explaining the situation to her mother, she hung up and turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "My parents saw the video on Facebook. My dad is a veteran, Marcus. He's so angry he can barely speak. My mom wants me to come home immediately and thinks I should break up with you." The personal cost of his actions was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Marcus wasn't just facing legal consequences and social media backlash. He was also losing the respect and support of people who mattered to him. The girlfriend he loved was being pressured by her family to abandon him, and his own family would soon learn about his behavior through the same viral videos that were spreading across the internet. Marcus's phone rang, displaying his mother's number. He stared at it for several rings, knowing that answering would mean explaining to his mother how he had embarrassed himself and his family on a national scale. When he finally answered, his mother's voice was a mixture of confusion, disappointment, and maternal concern. "Marcus, your cousin Jennifer just sent me a video that she says shows you getting in trouble at Arlington Cemetery. Please tell me this isn't real, honey. Please tell me you didn't really do what it looks like you did in this video." Marcus closed his eyes and tried to find the words to explain his actions to the woman who had raised him to respect others and show dignity in difficult situations. "Mom, it's real. I made a terrible mistake and now I'm facing federal charges and everyone in the country knows about it. I don't know how to fix this." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long that Marcus wondered if the call had been disconnected. When his mother finally spoke, her voice was quiet and filled with a sadness that cut deeper than any angry lecture could have. "Marcus, I raised you better than this. Your grandfather fought in World War II, and your uncle served in Vietnam. How could you disrespect fallen soldiers like that? How could you embarrass our family this way?" As Marcus tried to explain himself to his mother, Jake was researching the legal implications of his federal citation. "Marcus, you need to see this," Jake said, interrupting the phone call. "I found information about the penalties for violating federal regulations at Arlington Cemetery. You could be looking at a fine of up to $5,000 and 6 months in federal prison, and having a federal conviction on your record will affect your ability to get certain jobs, apply for government positions, and might even impact your ability to get professional licenses in some fields." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of the potential consequences. Marcus was a criminal justice major who had planned to pursue a career in law enforcement or legal services after graduation. A federal conviction would not only derail those plans but could also affect his ability to find employment in many other fields that required background checks. Sarah received a text message and looked at it with growing alarm. "Marcus, someone posted the video in our college's main Facebook group. There are already over 200 comments and people are recognizing you. The college administration is going to see this and so are all of our professors and classmates." Marcus felt the walls of his future closing in around him. His academic career, his relationship, his family's respect, and his plans for the future were all being destroyed by the consequences of a few minutes of stupidity and arrogance. The viral nature of social media meant that his mistake would follow him for years, possibly for the rest of his life. "I need to make this right somehow," Marcus said, though he had no idea how to begin repairing the damage he had caused. "Maybe I can write an apology or do some kind of community service or donate money to veterans organizations. There has to be something I can do to show that I've learned from this mistake." Jake shook his head grimly as he continued reading about similar cases online. "Marcus, I hate to say this, but some of these stories don't have happy endings. There are people who made similar mistakes and ended up with criminal records, expelled from school and unable to find decent jobs for years afterward. The internet doesn't forget, and veterans groups don't forgive easily when someone disrespects military service." The hotel room felt like a prison as Marcus contemplated the full scope of his situation. Outside, life was continuing normally for millions of people who had never made such a catastrophic error in judgment. But inside the room, Marcus and his friends were dealing with the reality that a single moment of disrespect had the potential to alter the entire trajectory of his life. Sarah looked at Marcus with a mixture of love and disappointment. "I still care about you, Marcus, but I don't know if I can handle being associated with this. My family is furious, my friends are embarrassed to know me, and I'm getting hate messages from people who think I should have stopped you. This isn't just affecting you anymore. It's affecting everyone who knows you." As the day wore on and the videos continued to spread across social media platforms, Marcus began to understand that his journey toward redemption would be long, difficult, and uncertain. The federal citation was just the beginning of his troubles, not the end. The real test of his character would be how he handled the months and years of consequences that were still to come. 3 months later, Marcus stood outside the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., wearing his only suit and carrying a folder full of character references, community service documentation, and a carefully written letter of apology. The weeks leading up to his court date had been the most difficult of his life, but they had also been transformative in ways he never could have imagined. After the incident at Arlington Cemetery, Marcus had made the decision to face his mistakes head-on rather than hiding from them. He had reached out to veterans organizations, volunteering hundreds of hours at VA hospitals and homeless shelters, serving former military personnel. He had also written letters to military families, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the importance of respecting military service and sacrifice. Sarah had ultimately decided to stay with him, though their relationship had been tested in ways that changed them both. Her family's initial anger had gradually given way to cautious respect as they watched Marcus work to make amends for his behavior. The viral videos had eventually faded from social media feeds, replaced by newer controversies and outrage cycles, but the lessons Marcus had learned remained with him every day. Inside the courthouse, Marcus waited nervously as other cases were called before his. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with a public defender who had helped him understand the seriousness of his charges while also developing a strategy to demonstrate his genuine remorse and commitment to change. When his name was finally called, Marcus approached the bench where Judge Patricia Williams, a stern-looking woman with over 20 years of federal court experience, reviewed his case file. Judge Williams had seen hundreds of Arlington Cemetery violations over the years, and she had developed a reputation for taking these cases seriously, while also recognizing when defendants showed genuine remorse. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Williams began, her voice carrying the authority of the federal court system, "you have been charged with violation of federal regulations governing conduct at Arlington National Cemetery. I have reviewed the evidence in your case, including video footage of your behavior and the testimony of the military personnel involved. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I take full responsibility for my actions, and I deeply regret the disrespect I showed to the fallen soldiers, honored at the tomb of the unknown soldier, and to the guards who dedicate their lives to protecting that sacred space." Judge Williams studied Marcus for a long moment, then reviewed the extensive documentation he had submitted regarding his community service and efforts to make amends. She had seen many defendants who expressed remorse only after being caught, but the evidence suggested that Marcus's transformation was genuine and sustained. "Mr. Thompson, your behavior at Arlington Cemetery was disgraceful and showed a shocking lack of respect for military service and sacrifice," the judge stated firmly. "However, I have also reviewed evidence of your efforts to understand the magnitude of your mistake and to make meaningful amends through community service and education." Marcus listened carefully as Judge Williams detailed the standard penalties for his offense, which could have included substantial fines and imprisonment. He had prepared himself for the possibility of serving time in federal prison, understanding that his actions had serious consequences that couldn't be erased simply through apologies and community service. "Given the evidence of your genuine remorse and your extensive efforts to make amends," Judge Williams continued, "I am sentencing you to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service specifically focused on supporting veterans and military families, and a fine of $2,500. You will also be required to write and deliver educational presentations about the importance of respecting military service to at least 10 community groups during your probation period." The relief Marcus felt was overwhelming, though he understood that his sentence represented a significant ongoing commitment rather than simply a punishment to be endured. The community service requirement would dominate his free time for the next 2 years, and the educational presentations would require him to repeatedly relive his humiliating mistake in front of audiences who might not be sympathetic to his story. After the court hearing, Marcus met with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez outside the courthouse. The tomb guard had agreed to meet with him as part of Marcus's effort to understand the full impact of his actions and to learn from someone who embodied the military values he had disrespected. "Mr. Thompson," Rodriguez said as they sat on a bench outside the courthouse, "I want you to know that what matters now is not what you did on that day, but what you choose to do with the rest of your life. You have an opportunity to turn your mistake into something meaningful by helping others understand the importance of respect and service." Marcus nodded, still struggling to find adequate words to express his gratitude for the guard's willingness to meet with him. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I know I can never undo what I did or take back the disrespect I showed, but I want you to know that your example of professionalism and dignity that day taught me more about character than anything I had ever experienced before." Over the following months, Marcus fulfilled his court-ordered obligations, while also continuing the personal mission he had developed to honor military service. His educational presentations evolved from embarrassing recitations of his mistakes into powerful talks about respect, humility, and the cost of freedom that resonated with audiences across the country. The viral videos of his confrontation with the tomb guard occasionally resurfaced on social media, serving as a permanent reminder of his moment of poor judgment. But Marcus had learned to view these reminders not as sources of shame but as opportunities to discuss the importance of personal growth and making amends for serious mistakes. Sarah graduated from college and began her career as a teacher, often incorporating Marcus's story into her lessons about respect, consequences, and personal responsibility. Their relationship had survived the trial by fire of public humiliation and had emerged stronger and more mature than either had thought possible. 2 years after his sentencing, Marcus completed his probation, having fulfilled all of his court-ordered requirements and having volunteered hundreds of additional hours beyond what was required.
He had found his calling in working with veterans and military families,
Eventually establishing a non-profit organization dedicated to educating young people about military service and sacrifice. Marcus never returned to Arlington Cemetery, feeling that his presence there would be inappropriate regardless of how much he had changed. But he often thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and the other tomb guards who continued their sacred vigil, honoring fallen heroes with the dignity and respect that Marcus had failed to show. On that spring morning, the story of Marcus Thompson became a cautionary tale shared in military, communities, and educational settings across the country. It served as a reminder that moments of poor judgment can have lasting consequences, but also that genuine remorse and sustained effort to make amends can lead to redemption and personal growth. Years later, when people who remembered the viral videos learned about Marcus's work with veterans and his educational mission, they often expressed surprise at his transformation. Marcus would simply tell them that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for the best versions of ourselves. If we have the courage to face our mistakes and the dedication to spend our lives making amends for them, the tomb of the unknown soldier continued to be guarded with the same precision and dedication that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had displayed on the day he confronted a disrespectful tourist. The guards' commitment to their sacred duty remained unchanged, serving as an eternal reminder that some things in life are worthy of absolute respect and unwavering devotion.